Hello, this is Jose Luis again here at Parametric Camp, and welcome to probably the last, if not one of the last videos in this playlist, Advanced Development in Grasshopper, where now that we have learned all the technical stuff, like how do you write C# code, how do you understand Rhino Common, how do you do scripting in Grasshopper, and then how do you develop native plugins. I would actually like to take some time now to perhaps have a conversation about all the other things that are not technical but are more conceptual and perhaps even psychological and creative about aspects of creating, developing plugins for other people or creating tools for people to use. And in that sense, for that, I would like to invite to this conversation for people whose work I tremendously admire, and I think it's extremely representative about the spirit, the technologies, and the ideas of helping other people be more creative. So what I would like to do is, first of all, I would like to introduce Andrew Heumann. Hi, Heumann. Hi, Andrew. You're on the video right now. Andrew is
Hi.
a computational designer who has worked in the past at NBBJ, Woods Bagots, and WeWork, and is currently working on Hyper.io as of the recording of this video, correct? And
Yep.
he is probably one of the most prolific Grasshopper plugin developers in this planet right now. He's written Human UI, MetaHopper, Shutterbug, Doodlebug, JSON, and the list keeps going on. And so, thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate your time.
It's great to be here.
Awesome. I would like to invite Rajaa to the stage. Rajaa is also a computational designer and an educator. She is an adjunct professor at the New School of Architecture and Design in San Diego, also a software developer at McNeil as of the recording of this video. She has written three core Bibles about everything that we have been learning in this playlist. She's written Essential Mathematics for Computational Design, Essential Algorithms and Data Structures, and Essential Guide to C# Scripting, all tremendously relevant to the things that we have learned here, and free and open source for everyone to check. Thank you so much for that, Rajaa. And she's also the creator of paneling tools, one of the earliest Grasshopper plugins, perhaps, and also one that is extremely popular. It has a lot of downloads on Food for Rhino. I just checked this morning before doing this. So thank you for being here, Rajan. I would
My,
like to invite to the stage Andy Payne. Hi, Andy. How are you doing? Andy,
hey,
Andy is an architect, computational designer, software developer, and fellow colleague from the GSD as well. He has worked previously at Case, at Autodesk. Even you had a thing going on with Tesla at some point, right? And the Proving Ground. And currently also working as a software developer at McNeil. He is the co-creator of Firefly, one of the most popular plugins in history of Grasshopper and fundamental to anyone who has ever done any kind of human-computer interaction or physical computing using Grasshopper as the base. Thank you for being here.
thanks for inviting me.
And I would like to welcome Mike Pryor as well. Hi, Mike.
Hey, how's it going?
Mike is a computational designer and an architect. He has worked previously at Trahan Architects, at Nike, and he is the founder of Design Morphine and the creator of a Master's in Science in Computational and Advanced Design. Correct?
Yes.
Yeah, awesome. He is currently a the head of procedural generation at Wilder Worlds, a metaverse company, correct?
Yep.
And he's also the creator of Pufferfish, one of the most popular and Grasshopper plugins as of right now on Food for Rhino for complex geometry generation, shape, form, and a lot of other things. That actually is actually quite comprehensive, more than 300 components, I believe, right?
Something like that around there.
All right. Beautiful. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for accepting my invitation. And thank you for sharing some of your insights with the community. So, as I said, this is the end of a playlist where we have learned a lot of the technicals about how to develop Grasshopper plugins, C# scripting, and doing computational geometry. But I would like perhaps to talk more about what goes into designing a Grasshopper plugin in the first place, or perhaps the more general conversation of when, as designers, as people who create tools for other people, how do we think about that process? So perhaps I would like to start the conversation with the general question of what motivated you folks to write a plugin in the first place and to make that a contribution to the community in the first place. So how did this start? What is your story behind this? And I might just want to throw Andrew under the bus just because he's the first one on the screen right now.
Sure. Yeah, happy to answer that. So I think the first plugin that I ever wrote, Heumann, grew out of some scripts that I had built for myself for my undergraduate architecture thesis. I had just built some stuff for working with like layers and objects in Rhino, and I found myself using them over and over again. And I was kind of interested to learn about the process of building Grasshopper plugins. And so I kind of took the code from those C# script user objects and kind of compiled them together into a plugin and made it available for other people. And then just kind of slowly started growing that over time. And I think a lot of the plugins that I've built have started that way. It's a tool that I built for myself. It was just like serving a need for something I was working on. And then I think Human UI grew out of maybe a more specific thing where I was finding that there was sort of a gap in how computation was being used at the firm I was working at the time, NBBJ, where people were a little scared to adopt Grasshopper. And I wanted to build a little bit of a bridge so that the tools that we were building in Grasshopper could be available to a wider audience. So that one actually grew out of kind of a real present need among my colleagues. We were trying to sort of figure out how to make these tools more accessible. And so, kind of started that way. So it tends to start as a little prototype and then grow into something that we can make available to others.
Rajaa, may I invite you to share your story as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in my case, since I started with McNeil a very long time ago, I mean, as writing maybe before Grasshopper, right? So everything we write there is based on a problem to solve for a user. So there are these users that are stuck with certain tasks or unable to achieve something. And then how about we add some functionality to Rhino to be able to support those people, like dynamic sectioning. So one of the first plugins I wrote was section tools, basically. And this is just a Rhino plugin. And for paneling as well, and pattern generation in 3D was a user problem. And then you start working with the users to see if that solved their problem, and it turns into a general use, basically, tool. And this is when it becomes a plugin that is published and shared with everyone. So I guess very similar to any other person here in the panel is always start with a problem that need to be solved. And then if the plugin facilitates that, then it is most likely going to be successful and widely used. That's kind of, in general, what motivates developing plugins, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Andy, how about you?
Sure, thanks. I find myself a little bit in the vein of Andrew and Rajaa in that it always starts with a problem for me. I also find it interesting that you framed the problem, Jose, and that the question is about developing plugins for other users, because for me, it's usually a pretty personal quest that I'm on. I have an idea that I want to explore. When Firefly first started, it was really about trying to connect with these physical computing devices, hardware like Arduino and sensors and motors. And I was always just kind of curious about those things. And I wanted to explore it more. And so I just started to develop the tools for myself. And then you put it out there in the hopes that maybe somebody else finds it interesting, but there's always a chance that no one else will find it very interesting. But really, that's not the key here. For me, it's really a question about exploring a problem and something that I'm very curious about, and then trying to develop that a little bit further to gain a little bit more knowledge about the problem and try to find a solution.
Interesting. Mike.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this was like people like your other guests here who were doing it much before I was. So that was like a big inspiration. And then just using Grasshopper like for so long, you kind of, I think when you're using it so long for every day, you kind of get to that point naturally where you want to kind of go further. For me, it was also personal, and then like I'm very much into the aesthetics that are attached to like the idea of computational design, um, and the so I wanted to kind of make those simpler to achieve. You know, things like gradients of things, scales, and rotations, and transformations, and these kind of things. A lot of things I was doing often. But I got tired of like wiring the same things together over and over and over, and also forced me to, as a project, to force me to learn C#, because I tried a few times in the past, just like with tutorials, and I always kind of just like left it or got like kind of bored. But once you have like a project, it's a lot easier to like stick to it and commit, I think.
Interesting. I hear a lot about, first of all, this is a problem that I had. So I started with this, but then it ended up in this plugin that like thousands and thousands of people in the world are using. That seems to me like a really big leap. So how does the decision of this is a problem that I have that I want to solve for myself, how does that turn into this is a problem that I want to solve for the rest of humanity? Because it's not trivial. That's one thing. And also, as someone who has developed one of the least popular plugins in Grasshopper myself, the idea of there's a really big jump in effort in making something that is for yourself and that you know how it works, etc. But then bundling it in a model that is understandable and usable by third-party people, a concept that I will get back in a second. What motivates you to put all this effort and all this emphasis and all this work for free, you know, which, and also work that could be seen as, hey, this was your IP, this made you powerful and valuable. You're giving that away for free for everyone, you know, you're losing your competitive edge, if you will. How does that happen?
I mean, if I can start a little bit, I think, you know, for me, I started operating that way in the Grasshopper community, sort of giving things away for free because that was how the Grasshopper community worked. That was already the sort of the way that people operated there. People were sharing scripts. I learned Grasshopper by downloading what other people did. I learned to write plugins by looking at what other people built. And so it just felt, it wasn't even a question. It wasn't like, oh, should I hold on to this thing? It was just like, oh yeah, of course I would put that out there because that's what we do. And I guess in hindsight too, it's been, you know, it's been incredibly important to the trajectory of my career to have, you know, sort of people I run into in the incredibly narrow space, which is like architecture technology, like know me from my plugins. And that's led directly to job opportunities. You know, I wouldn't be a full-time software engineer right now if I hadn't made that first move to like release a plugin when I was, you know, just starting out.
Interesting. So the value is not the object itself, but it's like what comes with that contribution.
Yeah, I could echo that a little bit. I completely agree is that, there's always short-term versus long-term views of what you see the gain of releasing something, right? I think you could take a very narrow view of saying, yes, I'm putting all this work in and I'm not really getting paid for it and blah, blah, blah. But the longer term, if you take a longer term perspective, you know, Rajaa and I both sort of published the first Grasshopper primer, which was made available for free, which was also a bunch of work. But obviously, we both sort of talked at the beginning, and we both realized that, if you take a longer term perspective of this obviously will have a pretty profound effect on the community as a whole, instead of just sort of, charging per download or something like that. It's not about that. It's really about trying to foster a community the other take I sort of have on it is that, if you don't do it, somebody else will. If you don't give it away for free necessarily, somebody else will probably make something that's equal to what you're doing and will give it away for free. And then, so you might as well just sort of take this as a learning opportunity as well, and sort of, promote your brand, or, whatever you want to take, whatever your view is on it. But I like to take a longer term perspective on some of these things.
Yeah, and probably I come to it from a different perspective, but to me, there is the personal growth side of things. You might sit with yourself and think you have the most brilliant idea, but I've been in this business long enough to know, to be humbled really, that even my most brilliant idea, once I put it out with people to use it and test it, I realize how much is lacking, how much growth I needed to do to be able to make anything useful. So sitting with one's IP or ideas, no matter how brilliant they are, it has no growth whatsoever. And I think growth is key here to contribute at any level. And I just want to address quickly another side of your question is the difference between solving your own problem and solving problem for the masses or for the general user. And this is another thing, it was a hard lesson for me to learn. When you first start writing any function or any automation, you have a specific purpose in mind and you can solve it very efficiently for that specific application. But once you want to share it with others, you will realize there is 100 different ways to achieve the same thing, and people use it differently. So it's a whole shift of mindset if you're writing for yourself as opposed to writing for others in terms of plugins or functionality and what have you. So it's an important consideration before starting or while you are sharing and getting feedback. You realize how many gaps you need to fill before it's useful. So this is very important. Yeah,
I resonate tremendously with your previous comment about personal growth, because for me, teaching is a lot of how I get that personal growth as well. The idea that I need to know something well enough to be able to distill it in a way that is understandable for other people. It's also a big jump in, can I use this thing? Whereas, can I explain this thing? It's two totally different games. But please, Mike.
Oh yeah, no, for me, I mean, it was like, the community building, I think is big. Like community building, definitely like the opportunities before and after are. It's not like there's more opportunities, but they're like different opportunities. I'd say, like even like Andrew was saying, like his job is probably completely different than he thought it would be when he was, I don't know, in architecture school or something. So like you get like a lot of more trajectories kind of, and ones you didn't really expect, I think. So that's cool. Like, and then, like you were saying, like the community stuff, like people kind of like know you for that thing. I also think like when you start charging money for things, you become somehow obligated to be kind of perfect and on time and on schedule and a bit less experimental. People don't really want to pay money for things that are kind of working. And I think that's where we maybe have a lot more fun, is on things that are kind of working. So that I think that's also a big factor for me, is kind of like, it's just a different thing you have to think about when you're charging someone money versus not charging money. Even like most softwares, like they have like the real tools and then they have like the whip tools, right? Because like because if you don't call it whip, then people will complain about that, right? So
it's almost as it's almost as if you're advocating for sloppy code.
No, but you know what I mean. Like,
joking. Totally joking.
Like it's a bit like you can be a bit more free in like what you're doing and putting out there, and even more responsive to like updates and feedback and this kind of things. I think it's pretty important. Like, how people are using it. So like, and then you said like, so if I made something for myself, it can be very specific. For instance, maybe it only works on like a curve or a very specific kind of curve. But then if you want to give that tool to someone else, maybe they want to use it on surfaces and meshes and polylines and curves. And So it's like you have to think about all these other conditions that you might not have been thinking about when you know, for the reason you made the tool specifically.
But there has to be a certain level of commitment, I think, for any plugin to be successful, because you know, at the end of the day, the most successful plugins were the ones that people who authored them stayed with them, maintained them, updated them over the years. You know, try to address the feedback and take it seriously and work with the users. You know, just being very uncommittal, completely experimental. You can write something, can put it out there, and there is a huge pile, perhaps thousands of experiments out there. It will be like maybe used, maybe picked, maybe forgotten very quickly. So there is a certain level of commitment that comes with if you want to create or believe in a course where you think your tools or you're adding value, you gotta kind of stay with it at some level, regardless of whether it's you know, free or not, I think.
That's your community. I mean, that's just your community building, right? Like, how important is that to like very quickly your community could be like, you know, forget this developer, we're going on to the next thing, you know, like, or you know, so that's definitely an important part of that, is like kind of being active and responsive.
And balancing with your personal life too. Can we go back, if we may, because when we were talking about how do we think about tools for other people, etc., etc., we were using the word user a lot, and I'm a big fan of Olia Lialina, who's like this early internet art activist, whatever, and she has this manifesto about calling users, and when you do that, it's kind of almost you depersonalize them. Whereas if you call them people, all of a sudden they become human, and it's kind of a different, you know. So to me, it relates to the idea of how do we think of other people? How do we think about how other people think? And therefore, how do we change what we made for ourselves versus what we make for other people? What are the assumptions that we throw on users or other people? What has your experience been? How do you think of other people? And therefore, how do you cater your code and your tools for someone that is not yourself? How does that mind shift happen in your particular case? To me, it's a really difficult thing, personally.
It's definitely difficult. If we're speaking strictly like Grasshopper, like a big thing for me that I always find myself like going through 3, 4, 5, whatever times, is that like things are consistent. Like if you call something a force here, it should be a force everywhere. Like, so people expect like what things are doing or what they're called. Like you wouldn't want to call on one component something a factor, and then another call it a value, and then another call it a number. Like, so like just things like that, I think makes it easy. And then like another thing I do a lot, which is maybe a bit like OCD, I don't know, is like I'm always trying to like make the inputs as same as possible in order, even though not every component has the same input, but as same as possible, you know. So like if factors at the top, then it should kind of be at the top, for like just so people expect where things should be. You know, there's the clean tree.
I was going to say it right now, where the input is all the way at the bottom.
It literally, I've been using Grasshopper for like 10 years, and every single time I put it in the wrong input, almost every single time.
Or certain components that you take planes and certain components that take frames, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Like, is it a plane? Is it a frame? Is it a, you know, like these kind of things. I think like the consistency is definitely what makes it easier on people, and the language you're using to like describe things in inputs, descriptions, outputs, you know, just to kind of all that kind of stuff, I think is a huge step, but it also takes a lot of time, and redoing. It's like, for me, like 50% of the time is like making descriptions consistent and making icons. I mean, it's not even mostly like code, you know.
I know. Making things for the public has so much overhead beyond the actual code.
Documentation, example files are really critical to this thing. I mean, I think, Jose Luis, you've hit on one of the core questions of software building, period. Like, forget about Grasshopper components for a moment, but this is a problem we wrestle with every single day. You know, building software for the public. I think when you build a tool for yourself, it's really well suited to your way of conceptualizing that problem. It has an embedded opinion about the sort of like concepts at play for a given problem that you're trying to solve. And sometimes, if you're lucky, when you build a thing for yourself, you happen to have hit upon a kind of a common representation or conceptual vocabulary that resonates with people. But I've also had the other experience, which is building tools, especially for people in other kinds of roles, or with maybe more or less like technical capabilities where those conceptual vocabularies don't align at all. And to me, the only tool that has ever been effective for me at getting past that is watching people use your tools. Get them in front of people as soon as possible. Don't wait until you have a final polished product that you can say, ta-da, here it is. It works exactly right. Instead, prototype, try stuff, put it in front of people, and most importantly, like observe them interacting with it. Like, see where they thought the input should have been. And then maybe the input should go there because maybe their intuition about it is something that's going to be common among the kinds of users you're trying to address.
I once conducted a formal user study for my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation. It was probably one of the most painful things I've done in my life because I had to sit there silently to not interfere with the subject of the experiment, you know, and I could see them fail using my stuff. And I was like, it's not like that, it's the other way. But to your point exactly, if the person wants to use it that way, it probably feels like it should be used that way, not how I thought about this problem, you know. It was very, very painful and humbling at the same time.
Self-discovery. I mean, you're also talking a little bit about self-discovery and user interface design and user interaction. All of that stuff is incredibly difficult. That's why, you know, there's entire disciplines in school dedicated towards it. So, and a lot of times that's not what we're coming from, that background. And so we're learning on the fly, I think. And a lot of times we don't necessarily do things correctly. And so that feedback is really useful, I think, as a designer. And I think also to echo Andrew's point about documentation, you know, icon design, there is a lot of stuff that goes on that when you do it for yourself, you know, you don't even need an icon necessarily. You can just let it hang out there. And I'm sure Michael really struggled if he has 300 components developing 300 different icons
that look consistent.
You know, exactly. And so then you've got to come out, and that's where the designer, that's fun too. But, you know, making pixel perfect icons at 24 by 24 that are readable. That also, you know, I worked on Lunchbox ML, which was machine learning, which there's a number of different components there that mean nothing graphically. And so trying to convey those ideas in a 24 by 24 pixels icon is incredibly difficult. So, you know, hats off. You know, I think David deserves a tremendous amount of credit for his core icon design in general, because they are really readable and they are really legible. And so, you know, would at least mention that he deserved a lot of credit for that as well.
I totally agree with that. And let's take like 10 seconds to publicly acknowledge David's work and congratulate him and thank him for this, because if it wasn't for him, we will probably not be having this conversation, and we will probably not be having the possibility of contribute all this knowledge, all this technology, and all this potential creativity for the community. His work is really remarkable. Yeah.
Right.
It was in one of David's old blogs. He was saying something like that the icon actually, like something like the icon's not really important to the function, like as long as it's something you identify with, like over time you identify it with the thing. But
is that why the bake is an egg? Is it fried egg?
I don't know why. I just remember reading that. I don't know why that like sentence like stuck stuck out to me for some reason, and I always kind of remember that was because his icons do represent the function. So, but it is something that he said that doesn't really necessarily have to.
Well,
There was a long discussion about the bacon there. Kind of very, very famous. But I guess just to circle back, I think there are 3 levels of making something useful for others. Is first, you are actually solving real problem with what you are proposing. So this is like number 1. The other thing is communicate it, to be able to design it with a style, with intuitive to use, easy, and the third part is how to help users or the people to kind of learn it. So all these documentation, icons, style, order, putting it in front of users, making as little assumptions as possible, solving it for one person, and then by the time you solve it for the third person, you pretty much have covered everyone else. So you slowly kind of take it from one person to the next, and you'll find it becomes a general use plugin. So all these things, but at the core of it, you are really solving real problem with the minimum set of components or the minimum set of functions, because once you exceed certain number, you really lose people attention and the ability to grasp how to use it. So complexity is not necessarily to your advantage. Always less is more, if you can get away with it, obviously. So more doesn't necessarily mean it could be more confusing. So there is that kind of balance that you have to make. And it's, it takes with time, with experiment, with putting people in front of what you create, really.
I think you hit on a topic there too, Rajaa, about, simplifying things, though, in that it does bring up this idea of bias that I think Andrew talked about a little bit as well, is that you start to make assumptions, right? If you try to simplify things too much, you start to make assumptions about how the user is going to work with the component. And so there's a trade-off a little bit of like, how much complexity do you add where you can adjust every 100 different settings for every different algorithm and vice versa? Or do you make assumptions and say, this is the set that we're going to allow? And so that's a tricky problem to kind of crack. And I guess that's where you get feedback from your users, obviously, but that's, and maybe that's also where you start to introduce different UI techniques of like embedding menus and vice versa. But, I think that's an interesting problem to try to crack as a developer.
I think the like on that kind of note, like a big one I can think of is that Grasshopper doesn't really let you control tolerance, and it seems like a lot of people want to control tolerance. Like if you look through the forums, everyone's always like a big issue is always tolerance. How can I change tolerance? Like, and obviously change it in Rhino and it changes in Grasshopper, but it's not so obvious, I guess, for new users that's the kind of connection there. So things like that too. It's like, like what are we assuming, or what are we just giving to them, or not telling them how to control, or is it even important to control? These kind of questions.
I hear this is super interesting. Perhaps this is perhaps the most difficult question I'm going to throw at you, perhaps, because I hear a lot about trying to find what are the measures. So what are the metrics to understand if we are being successful at helping other people with our tools, right? And I, particularly with my work, and perhaps the spirit that I want to convey also in this channel, is that all of these technical nightmares are okay, because at the end of the day, what we want is something that is design, something that is creativity, something that is, the technicals is fine, but ultimately what we want is to empower people, to make them more creative, more fluent, more expressive, all those shades of. But how do we measure that? How do we know if we're actually helping someone be more creative, someone expand their design capabilities, someone to make someone express what they want to express in a more Is it about easy? Is it about fluency? Is it about promoting iteration? Is it about quick results, flashy? No. How does this? How do you think about this problem? If you think if your goal is to promote creativity, let's say.
I think I don't necessarily try to think that I'm going to improve their design capabilities, but to kind of give them a set of things and kind of that they didn't have before and see what they do with it. I mean, that's kind of the idea. I don't really know what people are, and then more than half, like 90% of the stuff I see people do with stuff I make, I didn't even think they'll do that, or not even what I would have done. Or I'm honestly surprised at what people use it for. To be honest, like just compared to like the stuff I was using it for. So that's always really interesting to me.
So
yeah, I think to me it's more of a surprise. I really don't expect a lot of the stuff that people do with my tools.
They are used. I can tell you that much. But I mean, this is specifically a question I've been occupied by for a very long time, maybe from the very beginning. And you really hit my motivation to become a software developer for designers to start with. I have background in architecture, right? And I switched to building tools because I didn't think the tools that were available in the late 1990s were serving any creative purpose with architects or with designers in general. So, I mean, the idea of providing digital platform that helps people be creative in their design and express their design was my obsession, basically. And I think the main measure that I have used over the years is how I can minimize the gap between synthesis and reflection. So you put together your idea and be able to see it and reflect on it. The more in real time it is, the more successful it is. This perhaps why Grasshopper is immensely successful, is that you synthesize and see the result almost instantaneously, right? And so there is no gap between writing a code or scripting, which what Grasshopper is used for, and seeing the result of your script. The smaller the gap between synthesizing or reflecting on your problem or design, the more creative you can be as a designer. And that has always been the measure. With paneling tools, I started as a plugin for Rhino as well. All I was doing is basically trying to make it extremely efficient and fast to generate the patterns, edit them, update them, preview them, and then be able to then design with them, be creative with them. If there is any gap, you cannot be creative at all, just specifically about creativity.
That's a great point, Rajaa. I was trying to think of like how you measure success, and it's an incredibly difficult problem or term to try to define. But I think the idea of being able to, to quickly iterate on an idea and be able to visualize that in real time or near real time. I think for me, for Firefly, it was about developing these ways to connect the real world with a three-dimensional environment, which was kind of a really compelling idea at the time. I'm sure there's better tools or more tools now, but in 2009, really, you had the Arduino IDE, which is strictly, code, and then there was processing, which was two-dimensional graphics that you could generate, but there was no way to tie in a three-dimensional environment with these hardware devices like a sensor. And so for me, what became really powerful as an idea of interactive prototyping, if you will, is this idea of building something that you could then visualize in 3 dimensions, but use real world parameters like a light sensor driving a louver system, or, then have, that information come back out and drive a motor that is controlling your louver system. So it's this idea to be able to iterate or prototype a design more quickly. And that could either be just a digital form like regular Grasshopper parametric design, but also with Firefly, it became about this idea of prototyping physically as well. So how can we make that process happen more organically and also more fluid? And so that was a big driving force for my development, and also try to make that increase over time.
So I hear surprise, I hear fluency, I hear quick iteration, the lack of friction between the tools that we use to produce something and the tools we use to reflect on that something. Very interesting.
I will say when I was making Pufferfish, I mean, it seems like a lot of components, but I think I'm trying to deconstruct it enough so that it's not imposing
A bias.
specific output. Like, I don't know if that makes sense. Like, I don't want the tools to only do like kind of one thing, and then like that's kind of like the output of the thing. Because I mean, that's definitely necessary in some plugins and some tools, but I just, for like what I was trying to do, it wasn't like, I just didn't want like one specific type of thing to be.
Which is super interesting, because I think that's a cultural thing. I think that's an ethos that we had years ago, the idea of like the sandbox environment. Let me give you as atomized processes as possible so that you have all these building blocks to perform your own Lego composition. Whereas I am under the perception that in more modern times, the app culture is totally going the other way around, and it wants to be as biased as possible. Is this one app? It creates these results. You only have to press twice here, and then you get like this super flashy, like, I don't know, like this AI image that was generated from some text or something that is extremely, extremely biased, and it's a lot of bang for your buck, but no customization. No, it's two different cultures. I don't know. Maybe it's the old cranky man speaking now. Like all these youngsters and their apps.
I think they're both necessary. It just depends with like what you want to do. You know?
Yeah, and I think about it in terms of, like, because I think it's unavoidable. There is no tool that doesn't impart a bias of some kind. Even, the kinds of things you can draw with charcoal versus with a micron pen are sort of different in character. And that's true for all tools, and it's especially true for software tools. And I think that has to do also with sort of like a level of abstraction and granularity that's addressed by the tool. I think Grasshopper is really amazing because it operates at kind of like it's a higher level of abstraction than modeling in Rhino, in that instead of saying model this box, then model this box, it's like model a system of boxes. But it's also not going up the next level of abstraction, which is like, here's a one button approach to generate your system of boxes. So there's always these trade-offs between the level of intelligence embedded in a system, it's how opinionated it is, what level of abstraction it's addressing. And it really does operate as a spectrum. And there's enormous value in highly opinionated, highly intelligent tools. And there's also a lot of value in low-level, granular, low level of abstraction tools that just let you do whatever you want. And I think, the measure, to get back to sort of the earlier question for me, has always been about, again, what Mike brought up about surprise. Like, does it have sufficient flexibility and granularity that things can emerge from it that I didn't expect? I think that's really important in the landscape of creative tools specifically. Like, if all you could, I think about like early Instagram filters. If all they do is make all the photos like look like this one old Polaroid, it becomes boring and stupid really fast. But now they have all these editing tools built in, and you can actually sort of have your own style and stylistic intention embedded in how you wield this tool as a creative medium.
Then we end up with a global architectural style parametricism, right?
Funny about the Instagram filters. I feel like on that conversation, but then there's like the tech side too, right? Like, as the phone cameras get better, I feel like there's more filters, and I think people are using them less because the cameras are so good now. I know it's kind of like a weird.
That's interesting. You might be right. Yeah.
hardware versus software
Uh,
kind of flip there.
yep.
But how much filtering is happening on the camera side? I mean, there's actually doing a lot of stuff in the background that they don't show us that we don't have control over.
Well, that's the thing, like with the, with systems that are like having a lot of bias, like I guess then you have the question of like, do you trust the solution? Or like how do you know that you trust the solution? Yeah,
All
that's
right.
kind of the other
We're gonna run out of time very soon. I wanna ask you the last question. So
Sure.
for folks who are watching this video who just learned how to code in an advanced way into perhaps their first steps in creating a Grasshopper plugin, what would you recommend for those folks who might be thinking of starting their own project? And maybe this may not be exactly a Grasshopper plugin. This might be any piece of code or any tool that they're thinking of contributing out in the wild. What would you recommend for people who are thinking to engage in this project?
I would say go for it. Don't wait. Just go for it. Throw it out there, but don't be too attached. Don't have very high expectation. Your first and second and 10th will not work as you expected. And you should level your expectation, grow as fast as you can, engage people. There is a lot of energy in the community, in the making, and it's an incredibly rewarding process and rewarding sphere to be part of. So just go for it.
Hell yeah.
I would agree. I would say start today. I think it's also important to be passionate about the problem that you're trying to tackle. That could be just you're passionately annoyed at a problem that you're facing at work, or you have a really curious idea about some project. But I think it really takes a curiosity, a level of dedication to say, I really want to solve this problem, because you're inevitably going to come across pitfalls. You're going to struggle, I think, with some problems that you don't really know how to solve. There's amazing resources like Jose's camp. There's online forums. There's a lot of places you can go online to find help. But I would say don't give up on those problems. That's where you learn. That's where you begin to this journey of personal exploration as you develop this idea. I think that for me, and probably for most of the people here, that's the sort of brain chemical that gets released when you do something good, is that aha moment where you solve the problem and all of a sudden you're like, okay, I need some more. And so, it's the struggle through those problems and the exploration through it and finding the solution is what really makes it, a fun problem to solve.
I totally relate to that chemical thing. You just say like, oh, this was so satisfying.
Okay. Yeah. So for me, it's also to not feel like you have to kind of reinvent the wheel. I mean, there's a lot of resources and talented people out there. Like I remember actually like one example. I did these plane things, and then Andrew tried it, and he wanted like these quaternions, and I'm not like a quaternion mathematician, but I saw that like Daniel Piker had solved it in some way. But then I wrote to Daniel. I was like, hey, do you mind if I like check out your code and like change it a bit for this specific thing? Because I mean, obviously I was not trying to take his component, which was specific for that. I was trying to just use a piece of the code in a way to do something else. So that's also another thing too. Like if you're gonna do that, it's good to ask people, like, to use their stuff if you want, if you need it. And then also I think so I like rely on like the community and like what's out there. Ask people for permission is always a good thing to do.
It's a very good thing, very important. Mm-hmm.
If I mean, can't hurt to ask, and just don't just don't think that you have to kind of start from from nothing, because there's so much. There's really so much information out there. And lastly is, I think, just try to take like your own unique spin on things too, right? Like I mentioned with like Daniel, it's like you don't want to like say, hey, can I take your thing and then just like remake the thing, right? Like I just needed it for a small part of like a bigger thing I was doing, right? So it's also that.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo what Mike said, and just, I often think about it in terms of like reading is as important as writing. Like getting out there in the world and like looking at open source projects. When I think a lot of us started out writing Grasshopper plugins, there actually weren't very many open source Grasshopper plugins that were out in the world. Now there's a lot, and you can learn a lot from the way other people structure their plugins. And I think that's true even just for Grasshopper scripts or any kind of coding. Like just like see how other people approach the problem, and even copying it exactly, not necessarily to publish, but just to understand, like line by line, try and understand how someone is structuring something, and you will learn. I mean, that is how I learned to write code, period. Not just Grasshopper plugins, but like I learned to code by like looking at how other people solved a particular problem or built a particular feature on a Grasshopper plugin. The one other thing I would say, which is a little like low level technical, is get really good at debugging. Tools like Visual Studio's edit and continue debugger is really critical, so you can like make changes on the fly. And it's exactly what Rajaa was saying earlier about the kind of like time to seeing the effect of the change that you make. She had a more elegant way of putting it, but this sort of cycle of, action and the impact that action has. It's really important to be able to do that. And every code tool out there has some facility for this sort of, debugging, whether it's print statements or whatever else, just so you can really see what you're doing and understand what's happening.
That is extremely important. We had a couple of videos on that topic in the playlist.
Awesome.
It is.
And I think when we started Grasshopper, what was like, when I started, there was like, in terms of, except for just Grasshopper, there was like paneling tools, Weaverbird, and Kangaroo, and maybe Firefly just came out. I don't know, something like
Lunchbox, I think, was one of the first.
Yeah, like just came
Yeah.
out. Like yeah, there's so much stuff and information out now to take advantage of.
10 years in computational time is a long time. Yeah, the community has evolved and matured a lot. It's great. All right, before we wrap up, I have two very small surveys that I want to throw at you. The community here at Parametric Can is very divided in two very particular topics. First of all, are you folks Grasshopper icons people or Grasshopper text people on the component? Icon, Mike.
Text.
Andrew.
Icon.
Oh yeah, text.
Rajaa?
I use the icon, but I teach with the text.
Wow, so we are very divided in this forum as well. Oh boy. Okay, no one's perfect. And okay, and the other one, this is really, really important. C# or Python?
C#.
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 Very good. That was the right answer.
I like structure. I like good structure. I don't know.
You like constraints, right?
Yeah, it makes me feel
type
like,
safety.
yeah, I just feel more safe. I think it's a show. Like I feel like it's kind of like holding my hand along the way,
Beautiful. All right. I cannot express my gratitude for all of you folks being here today and sharing your thoughts with the community. Andrew, Rajaa, Andy, Mike, thank you so much for being here on behalf of myself and on behalf of the community. And we will see you in some other video or in some other occasion, and keep up with the really good work that you're doing. Thank you very much.
Great
Thanks.
pleasure.
Thanks for having us.